All right. We are so excited to begin our conversation with Rabbi Alicia. The conversation today is specifically over Passover and maybe a few lingering questions that I haven't been able to answer over what we've been studying in Exodus so far. And so I am going to actually just hand it over. Between last week and this week, I did send Rabbi Alicia a list of questions that were kind of a recap of some of our questions. We can get some of those. If you all have questions, feel free to raise a hand or jump in or add, because we want this to be a conversation. But with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to you, Rabbi. Is there like a good introduction to or a comparison? Any way to get us our toes wet for the discussion today?
Sure. So, okay. So I'm going to pull up the list of questions again because there were so many questions and I think it's awesome. So let me just pull that up again. But so I guess what I'm thinking about is, how have you guys been reacting to this story so far? Right? Like, I guess you've read the plagues, you've read the stuff about the blood and the water and how does it feel so far? I hear a giggle from you, Larry. How are you feeling so far? Be honest. You have to be honest. That's the only way this conversation is going to work. You won't offend me. My favorite thing to tell, I work with a lot of bar and bat mitzvah kids. My favorite thing to tell them is to disagree with the text is part of our responsibility, right? When we have this, maybe this is where I'll start. We have this blessing that we say in Judaism when we're studying Torah or studying text. And it is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, which means, blessed are you, God of the universe, holy energy, who has sanctified us, given us holiness with commandments, and entrusted us to struggle. La'asok is to struggle or to wrestle with the words of Torah. That is literally what we are doing, right? It is really important to me that people understand that disagreeing with the text or finding it like something is off here is actually the way that we study these holy words, right? Because no matter how you believe or what the main story is for you or whatever you're connecting with the most, to say like, I disagree with the way this text is written is actually a really holy act, because it means that you're not walking away from something that is part of your history and your story, right? So
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, Larry?
I think the fascinating thing to me was not that I would want to disagree with anything, but having waded through all the trials and tribulations, my wonder is, why did they pick those particular things? What you can get at sort of the overall significance. The people are suffering. They're suffering under Pharaoh. They're living in difficult times. But why those difficulties? Why locusts? Why frogs? Why this? Why that?
Right.
There must be some underlying significant reasoning to what the writers of those texts, what motivated them to pick those things.
Yeah. I mean, look, okay, so one of my favorite pieces of discourse is that in the frogs text, there are some Jewish commentators who say it was one giant frog, and some commentators who say it was a lot of little frogs, which to me is like hilarious.
Yeah.
The idea of one giant frog is it's like Hypnotoad. That's a very specific reference, but it's this idea of, okay, so why we're, and I think, to be fair with you, I think those maybe were some of the worst things that people could think of when they were putting the text together, right? like what could be worse? Like, not like, and when we're talking about these plagues, it's like, it's not just darkness, right? It's the idea that you can't even see in front of your face. They talk about how the darkness is thick, right? You cannot, there's no electricity, there's no fire, nothing, right? We're talking about locusts that were so like everything was destroyed, right? No crops were left. I think the idea here is to look behind what the point was. What was the idea of these plagues, right? It was to try to get Pharaoh to be like, okay, just go, just go, get out of here. Right? But at the same time, we know that it also says that God was hardening Pharaoh's heart. So the plagues had to get worse in order. And like, then why would God do the plagues in the first place? Like the question is always, wouldn't God just be like, make Pharaoh want the people to leave so that it would be easy for them? And the answer is, if God could do that, our lives would be real different. Right? So I, to me, it seems like those specific things were the ones that would affect the most people and would affect Pharaoh directly, and therefore it, may be the answer to what is like, can we get this guy on our side here? Can we get him to go? And the other thing was that the things that Moses had to do through God and Aaron is bigger than the magicians that Pharaoh had, right? They had to be bigger, right? Because when Moses goes the first time with Aaron and says, I'm going to turn this rod into a snake, then they do that same thing, and turn the Nile into blood, they do the same thing, right? So there's, and the hand into leprosy, they do the same. So it had to be bigger than Aaron and Moses too.
Okay. So you kind of touched on one of the questions we've been kind of grappling with over and over again is Pharaoh at some point is hardening his own heart. Like it seemed like with each plague, it kind of changes between like whether Pharaoh is doing this to himself or whether God is doing it to him. In certain points, the scripture in like the text, God is taking ownership of like, I am going to harden Pharaoh's heart. But the question of like, this is so brutal and so grisly, like, why? Why is it so violent in a way?
Yeah. Yes, agreed. Yeah. That's my question too. I think what's important for when I look at the text, I see. Let me just give you. I take this text very seriously, but I don't take it literally, right? And I don't know how you all necessarily look at this at scripture, but to me, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Like, and this is just my honest. I'm not sure that any of these things actually happen, right? I'm not sure that we're looking at a real life event, or if we're looking at history or if we're looking at stories that have evolved over the years. However, it almost doesn't matter because I call it our collective memory, right? This is our collective history, the collective memory of the Jewish people. Whether or not it happened is almost irrelevant. However, it's not completely irrelevant because these questions of like, this is brutal. How can you worship this God? How can you, to me, it is very obvious that people have had their hands in this. Right? If you ask an Orthodox rabbi, first of all, he would say, that's not a rabbi, so don't ask her any more questions. And second of all, then he would say like, he would say, this is what happened. Right? And to me, I think we have so much more room to look at this text academically and also to examine it and ask those difficult questions. Like, I don't necessarily know that the God of the Torah is a God that works for me. Because I need God to be loving and gentle, and I need God to be kind, and I need God to be within me. And I'm not sure that this character of God that they've written would necessarily work for me to be those things. And that's kind of a vulnerable thing to admit, but it's just true. Sorry, I cut you off, Susan. Go ahead, please.
I like that. It's reminds me when you said Paul is not my favorite.
Yeah.
The thing that I kept saying, why does he keep hardening Pharaoh's heart? That's the thing. Why does he make it worse by doing that? And then in the next chapter where they're talking about how to do the, I read ahead, I want to see what's gonna happen. They're describing how to remember this and how to observe the Passover. The Passover is they spared the Jewish people's firstborn children and animals from being killed, and because God hardened Pharaoh's heart. I mean, it seems I can see why you would say it's you're not sure that happened, but it's a really so that people will know that God is all powerful.
I think so. And also, you know, I mean, if we think about the story a little bit earlier, Pharaoh, not that tit for tat is an acceptable answer for anything. It never is, right? And you know, what is that thing? An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. But like, so you know, earlier in the story, Pharaoh took Shifra and Puah, who were the two midwives who were in charge of delivery of all the Hebrew babies. And I'm not sure that was them alone, but I think they had a network of midwives. That's just my personal opinion. Because how could you possibly deliver that many children in the same day? It'd be crazy. But they were the ones who were supposed to, you know, he said, you have to kill all the baby Hebrew boys, right? And they refused to do it. So it's sort of like it's like a mirror of what he asked to have happen to the Israelites, basically. So it's an interesting question, and it feels brutal. I mean, it's brutal. It's, to me, I'm not sure that it is necessary or that it was needed, but it is what was recorded and in the story. So, right. So it's okay for us to say like, this doesn't make any sense to me, or to say, you know, if we're looking forward at the story of Passover, how is it that what are we celebrating then? Right. That's the question. What are we celebrating this moment in which God is killing all these firstborns, and then we're saved, and so that's what we're celebrating? Are we celebrating freedom? What is Passover? Why are we doing that? Right. And that's the question I think that we're looking at here, is that what I often say is that being Jewish means holding multiple truths at the same time. And being a human being, to be fair, means holding multiple truths at the same time, right? So the piece of Passover that has always been very hard for me has been this part of like the first killing of the firstborns, and the idea that like once the Jews go free, the Egyptians all drown in the Red Sea. But there's something very final about that moment, that whether or not it happened, it is the end of the end of a chapter of a story, right? It is the end of an era in some ways, which is what needed to happen in order for the Israelites to be in the next phase of their, you know, of their experience. However, when we look at Passover today, what we're celebrating is freedom, right? We're not celebrating the angel of death stuff and whatever, like the blood on the doorpost and everything else. We're celebrating the idea of freedom and what it means to us as individuals and as a people, which I think is why it's easy for folks who are not Jewish to relate to it. So because that celebration of freedom exists in a lot of different cultures. So that's, you know,
I'm glad you brought up the idea of freedom, because it doesn't come without a price. We have to work for freedom. And when the Jewish people went through this time of waiting to cross over, they had to wait and be patient, and it took a long time, and they learned something from that. So for future generations, they could look at the hardships that were there in the past, even whether they happened or not, and consider the things that they have to go through yet to get their freedom.
Yes, absolutely.
So one of the things we had been talking about is kind of trying to find a similar, not something that is one-to-one, but something that could help us like understand the emotion of it. And we had brought up like, how do we think of things like the end of World War II, which came at the cost of a lot of, or well, at least on the one front of the war, it's like it came at the cost of a lot of Japanese individuals who were citizens. And how there's that like brutal difference of like, yes, that part of the war ended, but like there's also a huge human toll. And we don't there was that day that was celebrated for a long time, but we like today we have Memorial Day, and like how is that different? Because today it tends to be more celebrations and sales, and not always like that reflection of or what was the cost that is associated with the celebration. It
is something that we continue, I think we wrestle with that in a lot of areas in our like in public life now, we think of, I mean, the World War II conversation is an interesting one, because especially because knowing that already, 7 million people had been systematically killed, and then you say like, well, what's this many more? And the answer is it's this many more, right? So it's a question, it's a question of humanity and human life, and also how do you wrestle with this idea of, was it evil, was it, all those things. It's complicated. It's not an easy time. And what's interesting too is that Passover today looks so different and also the same, right? It's ancient and it's new.
So can you talk about that? Because this is one of the things why I really wanted to bring you into the conversation. So for context for everyone, Rabbi Alicia and I meet up for lunch semi-frequently, and I was talking about this study, which is what gave me the idea of bringing it in, and some of the things that we had talked about, and like, we just read about like sacrificing lambs, and like the scripture says, do this forever, and like spread the door on, or the blood over your door. And I get the feeling like that's not how you celebrate today. So can you tell us some of the like ins and outs of what Passover looks like today, and how it's the same, how it's both that ancient and modern thing?
Sure. So what I want to say is, when you're reading Torah, you're never reading it alone, right? You're always reading it with commentary or text from the rabbis and the sages, starting about the year around the year 70-ish, when the Second Temple was destroyed, right? And this is a long answer to this question, but I just want to give you some context, right? Because when the Second Temple was destroyed, sacrifices were no longer happening, right? There was not a place to do that. The religion had become centralized in a way that made it so that it was no longer, you could no longer practice it without that piece of the puzzle. So what happened was the rabbis, and really we call them the sages or the teachers of the time, got together and started to try to figure out how they were going to fix this thing and make it so that Judaism could survive in other ways. Now, the other thing I want to say about that, of course, is that it was more than likely that was probably already happening before the destruction of the temple, because of the role of who was ruling at the time, and who was allowed to be in those public spaces and who wasn't allowed. So it's more than likely that these things were kind of, these conversations about how do we bring Judaism into our homes or into different places was probably already happening at the time. Just like, and this is far after the Torah has already been written. Everything's already done, right? So what was happening was that people were trying to figure out, okay, so this is what it tells us to do. How do we do it? Right. And so when you read Torah, you don't ever read it in a vacuum. You always read it with commentary or with rabbinic text, because, it gives us a more updated version of it, which then of course allows us to make our own commentary, our own midrash, our own commentaries on the text because that's what our ancestors were doing, and that's what we continue to do, and that's how we continue to evolve. So Passover today looks really different than Passover did in the text, right? So it talks about the lamb and the doorpost, and if you have a small house, then you share the lamb with other people. And there are some aspects of that are true. You're supposed to say, all who are hungry, let them come and eat. Like, everybody is supposed to be together. There's no, like, Passover can be, the rabbis acknowledge it can be kind of expensive because you have to have all these different courses and all these meals and whatever. So nobody is supposed to go without a Seder because they can't, right? But Seder, the word Seder means order. And it was sort of developed by, when you're reading through the Seder, it's written in a book called the Haggadah, which means like the story. Right. And it's interesting because it's actually not this story. We're not reading Exodus. We're reading the story of the rabbis who were telling the story of the Exodus. Right. So we're already like a couple of generations. We're like a couple of steps removed from this actual text. Like, and then it says things like, if you don't explain the Passover sacrifice and the matzah and whatever, then have you had a Seder? And the answer is maybe. So basically what we do is we sit down and we go through this thing that has a very precise order. The Seder has an order, and for each thing, there's an explanation. A lot of this is based on the idea that while the story was trying to be retold and the rabbis were trying to retool all of this, the Greeks, the Hellenes, were having these symposia. Right, the symposium was this like long, fun meal with some debauchery involved for sure, and it was about drinking and staying up all night and telling stories, and young kids were starting to get involved. Like young kids, I mean, complicated because when you live to be 40 or whatever, then young kids is before 8. But like these younger adults were starting to get involved in this. And the rabbis were looking for ways to make this more interesting. The whole idea of the Seder is to involve the next generation in feeling attached to the story enough to pass it on to their children or to the next generation after them, right? So we sit down, there's a lot of different parts, and each part has it as a meaning. We do things that never would have been done, right? So but they harken back to the idea of what was happening at the temple. So at the temple, the priests would eat like parts of the sacrifice because that was the deal, but they would also have little other pieces. So matzah, which we talk about being the bread of affliction, the idea of, it didn't rise in time, so we had to go, was actually like one of the flat bread was one of the things that they ate with the sacrifice, along with some other little hors d'oeuvre things. So now if you go to a Seder, you might see us like dipping foods, right? So we dip parsley into salt water, we dip different things, because in the symposia, dipping stuff was a sign of wealth. A lot of this is based on the idea that like, what were the wealthy Greeks doing? How could we do that thing, but make it Jewish? So that was sort of the idea behind some of these things, right? Go ahead.
Can I jump in for a moment just for like an interesting parallel to like help bring us into context? Mm-hmm. So this is happening at a similar time that like the Jesus fan club is figuring out what they are doing as well. Mm-hmm. So like both traditions are very impacted by the destruction of the temple and the like, oh shoot, what do we do now? Mm-hmm. And so some of the similarities are not because they grew out of the same tradition, which notably, like neither tradition like is the same as like the second temple. But some of what the early Christians were doing was trying to do the same thing. It's like, that's why communion looks the way it does, is because they were going in houses and having parties and telling the story of Jesus, which is why there's a lot of wine and a lot of bread. And so that's where you can see kind of parallel evolution, because both groups are saying we're doing what the Greeks are doing, but we want to do it to like that in a way that fits with us. So I just want to draw that parallel because I find it fascinating how like these different groups of people were like, hey, the Greeks are doing something fun, we want in, but we don't want to do it exactly the same.
Right. We have to make ourselves different.
Right.
But also we like that thing. So let's try that.
Yeah. So sorry to cut in.
No, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you said that. So today we get together for Seder. We do these 11 or 12, I feel 14 maybe steps. And then we drink 4 glasses of wine. Each of them is symbolic of some other piece of the Seder, of the puzzle. We of the story. We eat the matzah, we tell the story. But we are looking at it for me anyway, I look at the Seder as a way to engage our youngest people, right? They say there are many stories of people sitting at these, and you're telling the whole story. So you're giving are you reading all of the Aramaic and all of the Hebrew and all of the everything? How are you engaging people? What's the, and if we want kids to be telling this story to the next generation, then it should be fun for them. And I think older folks always find it more fun when kids are having fun, right? When kids are engaged, it makes everybody engaged. And the number one idea of the Seder is question asking, right? That is, if you were to say to me, Rabbi, what is the fundamental way that Jews study? I would say asking questions, right? We are, like I said, wrestling. We are asking questions. So there's a story of a rabbi who, in the middle of the Seder, would take the table and rotate it 90 degrees, and then wait for somebody to ask him why he did that, right? And the idea was, why would you do that? Well, this is, and then you can start the story from there. There are all these different ways that we engage kids, that we think about question asking. The questions are written into the text, and also we ask our own. And so observance today is not a lamb and a sacrifice and a whatever. It is a shared community meal with a lot of different little parts, telling the story of Passover. And also we eat a lot of foods that are supposed to represent other foods, right? So I mentioned the parsley dipped in salt water. So the parsley is called the karpas. It's like the green vegetable, and you're supposed to dip it in salt water to remind you of the tears of your ancestors. But the greenness is supposed to represent the idea of hope and growth and whatever. And so you eat that. And we eat an egg at the Seder, and an egg is representative, just like for you guys, of spring and of newness. And the thing is that, of course, this was a time, the timing of this became part of an agricultural thing, right? So what's growing and what's new and what's a rebirth and what's freedom. So it's all sort of overlapping in that way.
So if there's no questions from you all, I have tons of questions, because one of the things that I'm also fascinated by is you talked a lot about how the Greeks influenced a lot of this, but we also know that a lot of a significant portion of the Jewish community ended up in Europe.
Right.
And the European context also changes things. So I'm curious how that kind of movement of people also influenced something that started in the Mediterranean and then went to a very cold environment.
Sure. The potato is a great example. So one of the things, and horseradish too. So one of the things that we do is we eat a bitter food called maror. It comes from the word mar, which means bitter, and it's this reminder of the bitterness of slavery, right? And so Ashkenazi Jews, or Jews from Europe, Jews who have roots in Eastern Europe, specifically Germany, Russia, etc., eat horseradish root as a reminder of this bitterness, right? Jews who landed in the diaspora landed in Morocco or Tunisia or Middle Eastern countries, who are Mizrahim, which was the name that we call them, or Sephardim people who landed in Spain and Portugal. Those folks eat different types of bitter herbs. They eat arugula and other so. The influence of European culture is also here, right? Because part of it is about luxuriating in and being fancy, and so we lean and we rest and we go slowly, and part of it is that in Judaism we often we add to the stories, but we never take away, right? So, which means that it's one of the most amazing things that all minority opinions in the rabbinic commentary are all preserved. But it means that all rabbinic commentary, all the minority opinions are preserved. So you're reading everything, right? So in this we're reading like, oh, we don't do this one anymore. We do this thing. And so the move to Europe is an interesting question, because it is really where so much of this was codified, right? Where the Haggadah, the text, was written down, where the text of the how do you do this was written down. So and what you find is that people have different traditions that if they come from different places, which I think is it's awesome. You know, the idea of Jewish culture that we think of in this country with bagels and whatever, like all that stuff is really very Eastern European heavy. It's white, comes from like, you know, from Germany, from Russia, which is where a lot of folks landed in New York. And that those cultures mixed, but there are Jews from all over the world, right? There are Jews who celebrate things totally differently and who speak different types of, like, their Hebrew dialect is different and their songs are different and the food is different and the Jewish culture looks different for them. And so it's important to remember that it's not a monolithic people, right? It's an ethnicity, but there's also other pieces of ethnicity involved here. So I hope that answers that question, Chris, because it's a great question. And I think the other thing was when people in the diaspora, right, there's this longing for going back to the way things were, right? And which I think can sometimes be damaging, honestly, because the idea of longing for how things were can often remove you from being present. But we added this whole layer of like next year, we say that at the end of the Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem. And we don't necessarily mean like, may we all, like, we mean, you know, for me, it doesn't mean like, may I be in Jerusalem next year. It means like next year, may the world be fixed. May we look at it in a different way. May our diaspora end, those kinds of things. But people are longing for a home that they never lived in, but that is in our ancestry. And so those kinds of pieces all exist within the same story. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but there's like two versions of Passover kind of in the text, right? There's like the blood and the mantle. This is why we do this Passover. And then there's also the matzah on the back thing, also Passover, right? Get out quickly and the sacrifices. And this is how you're supposed to do it. So acknowledging that, and I'm sure in Genesis, you guys realize there's like two sort of different versions of the creation story, which is wild. So it's the acknowledgement of holding some version of those things were the truth. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's one thing that I love. So we very much focused on like the many different sources, and this is where I brag about you all so much, is because this group asks sometimes better questions than I heard in seminary. Because like sometimes the question is, wait, is this the priest kind of coming in and adding detail? Which source are we talking about again? But yeah, we can, it's been stitched together. And
for sure.
We've been definitely talking about that.
Yeah. Yes. It's so one of the things that I'm really passionate about, Chris, is if it's okay for me to talk about?
Yeah, go for it.
Is, you know, you hear a lot of stories about Christian folks holding seders, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Is that okay for me to talk about right now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So to me, this is a really interesting concept, because what Jesus was doing at the Last Supper, if that was a Seder, well, I wouldn't even call it a Seder. If that was a Passover celebration, let's call it that. If that's what was happening, does not look anything like what we're up to today. Let me tell you, like, if that was happening at the time, there was, you know, the temple was still there. And so the sacrifice was being eaten in a different way. Like this was being celebrated so differently. So it's interesting to me that people have taken that and been like, oh, we'll do the celebration that sort of comes from the European tradition, that comes from the rabbis, that comes from I'm like, okay, well, do the thing or don't do the thing. but I'm not sold on the idea that it was a Seder. It certainly is not what a Seder looks like today, which, by the way, you guys are all invited to our Seder. If you want to come to our Seder for Passover, we would love to have you. It's in a long time from now, but we'd love to have you. We'll figure it out. But it's just a different experience than I think, we spend this week, right? So what we do is we take time to prepare, right? I like to call it spring cleaning. Basically, you're cleaning out your house. People do this in different levels. People will get rid of their leavened products, which is a while. Okay, so the thing that we know is like, don't eat any leavened bread, right? But then it's become this whole thing about like, okay, so then you don't eat pasta, then you don't eat peas, then you don't, like, what things look like leavening, even if they aren't leavening. And like I mentioned before, Jews from different cultures do different traditions, right? So for Ashkenazi Jews like myself, we don't eat rice because rice leavens, but like in the Mizrahi, in the Middle Eastern Jewish cultures, rice is like a diet staple, and therefore it's not a leavened product, it's different, right? So everybody has their own tradition. So you spend time clearing out your house. Some people put a different set of dishes. None of this stuff, by the way, is in the Torah. It doesn't say use 2 sets of dishes, like use this set of dishes and then this set of dishes, meat and milk and blah, blah. It doesn't say that, right? But these are all commentary from and what we know from years and years of learning from the rabbis, right? And they do this thing called building a fence around the Torah, where they're like, okay, this is what the Torah says. So this is how we have to expand this to make sure that we're doing it right, because we don't actually have the answer of are we doing it right. So this is the best that people could come up with at the time. So we spend a lot of time cleaning up, and then the day before you search for leavening, like the last leavened products in your house, which oftentimes for kids, it's like you put out tiny pieces of bread for kids to find with like, it's one of my favorite memories growing up as a kid. My grandparents used to do it for us. It was lovely. And then you spend the next week, the first 2 nights you do Seders, and then you spend the next week not eating bread, like leavened products. And to me, this is about, I think anything that you put in your body, we're remembering that our bodies are holy, right? Anytime we eat something, if we offer a prayer first, we're remembering our bodies are holy and we're feeding these holy vessels with the food that we're eating. And so the idea of doing this for a week reminds us of this story, connects us to our ancestors in a different way, while at the same time reminding us that our bodies are vessels for these memories and for this story. But it looks so different than what we're reading in the text.
Yeah. There's a thing that is fascinating when you actually write down a story and then tell it for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
Is what I talk about is there's like fossilized elements of it.
Yes.
That, so Jesus was talking with some of the thought leaders at the time, and some of the arguments he's having are kind of like, or I've sometimes explained it of like arguing what fence should be drawn around the Torah. Right. He's not necessarily debating the words of the Torah, he's debating the fence.
Right.
Because
exactly.
that was still very much being negotiated.
Exactly.
But we have those arguments fossilized and entombed, which those conversations have continued, but we have the arguments. And with what Jesus was doing at the Last Supper, now this is one where like our tradition doesn't even agree. The 3 Gospels say that the Last Supper was the night of Passover.
Right.
Of course, the Gospel of John never likes to agree with anything. And the scriptural analogy is that it was before Passover because Jesus is the Passover lamb. And we can debate whether or not that's an appropriate thing to say or not. But like even our tradition doesn't agree with itself of like, what kind of meal was this?
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but of course that makes sense to me that would be John's argument. John would say that. That seems reasonable.
Of course, because he's the contrarian. But this is one of the things that, like I said, both traditions continue to evolve from that point.
Right.
So it is not appropriate, in my opinion, or there's some translation things that I have a beef with modern translations. I like to, most of our translations use Jews in reference to the people in Jesus's time. And I say it's more appropriate to say Judeans.
Yeah.
Because it has time separation, because so many people think that Jewish people today have the same religion as the people Jesus was in conversation with, and that's just not really the way
it's not true. Right.
Not true. Right.
Right.
So like we can thank you for the invitation to go to a Seder, but that is to like honor your all's tradition today, not to do what Jesus
That's exactly
was doing.
right.
We have our own research of like figuring out what was going on at the table.
Right.
And that is a different conversation.
For sure. And that's what's really important. Like we would love to have you come and see what the tradition is like and whatever, with the caveat and understanding that like Jesus's Last Supper was not a Seder. It was not this. It did not look anything like this. There were no potatoes. There were no parsley. There was no dipping, and there was no stopping for different, cups of wine, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff is what you said. It's all evolved, right? Just because it's impossible to live in a world and not modernize. Even folks who are Orthodox, who are, whatever, who adhere to things differently, who dress in a way that like but they're dressing in, so the black and white shirt pant situation that you may have seen is the dress of rabbis from, the 16th, 17th centuries, 18th centuries in Poland and Russia. Like Jews from other places don't dress that way. They dress differently, right? So it's a really important reminder that things evolve, and then we get stuck, and then we evolve. And even modernizing Jews, right? That the Judeans who Jesus was beefing with are not the Jews of today. That's for sure.
Not the same.
Not the same. What I have given you guys so much information. I can only imagine that this is like a little overwhelming. Do you have thoughts, comments, other things you want to make sure that we talk about?
I'm liking the idea, or the I don't know what word to use, that what is being written in the Bible or Torah is the result of the rabbis many centuries later, and their interpretation. And we've been taking things rather literally as far as the plagues go, and I'm liking the idea that you suggested, that they were trying to come up with the most I'm going to use the word horrific situations, like the locusts, like turning the Nile to blood, whatever. I'm liking that look at the text. And I think in some ways we really have been looking at it literally. We were hung up on how long the plagues would take from the first to the last, and researching that it was probably a calendar year. And I'm ready to move away from that kind of literal thinking based on the suggestions that you've made to us today.
Thank you. I want to be really clear. I don't think that the rabbis wrote the text. I think the rabbis took the text that was written and then interpreted it, right? So
Okay.
But I do think that people did put the text together. I just don't think it was them, because it was before the idea of rabbis even really existed, which didn't really start until after the year 70. So, it was definitely, I think people were definitely involved in telling the story. But I do, Mary Ellen, I really like the idea of moving away from that, like how long, because it's easy to get stuck in like, how long did it take, and what was the thing, and what were the details, and the reality of those answers is we don't know.
Yeah.
Right. We just don't know. There is no, right. When it says 40 days and 40 nights in the Noah story, often the number 40 is used to mean a long time.
Yeah.
Right. Just like the number 3, the 3 days is used to mean a shorter time. Right. 3 days later doesn't always mean 3 days. It sometimes just means less time than 40 days.
Yeah.
Right. So understanding that the text can sometimes be interpreted as getting stuck in the timeline is easy because we love concrete details, but the reality is the ambiguity of the text is what's so beautiful about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. We've occasionally talked about the difference. I mean, there's different modes of looking at scripture is how I talk about it. Because I've had to, like, in my world, I've like gone toe to toe with people who are very like biblical literalists.
Yes.
And I think it robs some of the beauty of looking at it as a piece of literature.
Right.
Like you would analyze, I mean, like Shakespeare differently than a lot of people want to analyze scripture. But the question, and I remember we talked about this, especially in Genesis, when things are very more mythological sounding, is like, what are they trying to say about God?
Right.
What is this saying about their experience of the divine thing? Like, we don't have to disagree of whether like the history of it, but thinking of this as someone's experience of the divine kind of puts it in a different lens of what are they experiencing? What are they understanding? And I feel like as we go from like the mythological kind of sounding stuff of creation, the story gets a little bit more concrete and like more human or that's the wrong way to sound. It sounds more like history. So it's easier to then sink down into the details of like, how long did this take? But the same thing goes for all of scriptures. What is people's experience of God in these stories?
Right. Right. And that's even before you get to the conversation about Leviticus and Deuteronomy and how they're written and who wrote them and whatever. Like, right. The getting lost in the details is so easy. But thinking about the experience, Pastor Chris, is a great idea. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. What other ideas, questions do you all have? Because I still have my list going of questions you all asked me before if we want to revert to that. So what are your questions right now? Yeah, go for it, Clay.
I wasn't here last week, but I'm seeing that one of the other questions is this the most widely practiced Jewish holiday? And what are some of the other major holidays?
Well, the answer to your question is this is the most widely practiced Jewish holiday in the home, which is really interesting because, for so long it was centralized, but like even folks who don't do anything else will have a Seder. And I think it's because the idea of freedom resonates so deeply with us, right? We are still living in the shadow of the Holocaust, and we are still living in the reality that like every century Jews have been kicked out of somewhere, right? And the idea of current anti-Semitism and current persecution of Jewish folks. Like, so for us to have something, even people who don't believe in God or like think that the story is, irrelevant, this idea of gathering with folks and talking about the history of resilience really is meaningful. And so I don't know that I don't know if it's the most widely practiced, but it's certainly at home it is the most widely done at home for sure. Other major Jewish holidays, we have a Jewish holiday every week called Shabbat or the Sabbath. Friday night, all of our holidays start sundown the night before. So Friday night to Saturday night, right? And that is the word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word is Shabbat, which comes from the word shevet, which is sit, and also Sheva, which is 7, the seventh day. Sorry, I had to do one. No,
go for it. It's
one
great.
Little Hebrew guy, and so we spend that day, and it looks different for, like, I see the question of like, do different sects celebrate it differently? The answer, of course, with Shabbat, just like everything else, is yes, right? So it's a day of rest, a day of, and then other major holidays are coming right up. So Rosh Hashanah, which is our new year, is September 15th and 16th, and then Yom Kippur, which is our Day of Atonement. these are not like Rosh Hashanah is more of a celebratory day. Yom Kippur is more of a serious day. We fast and we do, so those are sort of the major. And then after that, we have Sukkot, which is the festival of booths, I think is how, and then we have Simchat Torah, which is the celebration of the beginning of going back to the beginning of the Torah, because the Torah is read in an annual cycle. And so we go back to the beginning of the story. Those are all, so like the month of September and October, and the Jewish calendar changes every year a little bit, because we're a lunar calendar with a solar influence. So unlike Ramadan, for example, which is just straight lunar, and so it changes like because the cycles of the moon change, we try to keep it in the same, like this is a harvest festival, it should be around harvest time, but here's how we do it, right? Yeah. So that's so September and October I call it the Super Bowl of Judaism. For me, that's how it feels. It's like Christmas and Easter all together, basically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, Mary Ellen, what you thinking?
Well, I'm going back to something that Rabbi Alicia said earlier. And Rabbi, you said that you would not be comfortable with the God of, I'm going to say history. I don't know how far back, whatever, that you needed a more loving God in your experience. How do you make the transition in Judaism from all the written texts showing God's vengefulness, his ability to be destructive, etc., and move on to a loving concept of God?
It's a great question. The answer is that the answer goes back to the idea of holding many truths at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. The answer goes back to this idea of like, this is the history of the people. This is what they knew. This is what they wrote. What do I feel? What do I believe? What do I need? To be honest with you, it being in community and in relationships with a lot of Christian folks has really helped me understand that, because I have found that and understanding the more hidden traditions of Judaism, or like the traditions that are practiced less. We are so focused on an academic, logical like interpretation that sometimes we do that, I think we do that in general to protect our feelings, right? Because feelings get hurt, but logic is logic, right? And so for me, it has meant tapping into what I know about myself to be true, and understanding that there are other people in the Jewish tradition who, right? Like for me, meditation has been one of the ways that I've connected to God. And a lot of people say, oh, that's like Buddhist, that's not Jewish. But the truth is that meditation is in the Torah. Like if we're looking for the answers, they're in the Torah, right? And so for me, it's about being willing to understand that God here was written, like God is an infallible source written by fallible people, right? And therefore, all the aspects of God can exist at the same time, and understanding that people could only write from their experience, right? So the destruction of whatever, I'm not sure that it was God. Maybe it was nature, I'm not sure that it works for me to say that like the flood definitely happened and it was God saying, Noah, you're the only righteous one. Like I just, sometimes natural disasters occur and people write them down in a way that makes sense to them in the way that they can process it. I think Christianity, you guys have the leap to thinking about Jesus in that loving context, right? For me, it's been understanding that God has so many facets. In Judaism, we say God has 72 names, right? And we don't know them all, right? And the one that we pronounce, Adonai, is actually not what's written on the paper. What's written is Yud, He, Vav, He, which are 4 Hebrew letters. Mm-hmm. And they're not actually pronounced out loud, but if you were to try, it sounds like you, right? Which is how sometimes people get Yehovah or Yahweh.
Yeah.
Because they think like, this is how this was written, these sounds mean your God's called Yahweh. No, it's not. But that to me is the sound of breath. That like, yeah, that's what breath sounds like. And I have that, which means that God is within me. So that's sort of how I've been working on it. And it's
Carmen, I mean, are you, pardon me, but flying solo on this, or is there a general understanding among Judaism today that God has a more loving, caring side?
I don't think I'm flying solo. There are certainly other people doing what I'm doing, but I think it's about re-examining our past and understanding our future. And so I don't know that you would get that answer from everybody, but I know you would get a lot from folks who are understanding that like we need more than what we have.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think one of the dangerous things in religion is ever thinking that it is static. That it's why I find the idea of like, let's go back to the fundamentals, let's like recall this thing in the past. That is always a recreation. That's never actually been, you can never go backwards. But understanding that there is no one place and time, but also like the influence back and forth is so key in religions in general. Like understanding that key elements of like traditional Christian theology that are in the gospel come from Zoroastrianism, like straight out of their religious text, and we just absorbed it and then mostly forgot about it. But there's still mixture going on today, and people trying to, or I think one of the things I find very helpful in like my own kind of like grappling with things, and I know I'm not alone with this, is some people see the need to take the next theological step. Like there's like building on where we've come from, we see where we need to go. And so the question is, do you invent something? Which is what a lot of Christian theologians who are trying to kind of revamp and retool some theology, some of them want to like create whole cloth, some kind of new ways of thinking. The way I like doing is kind of looking around it. Who has already done some of the theological work so I don't have to create the wheel from scratch? And one of the things that I've brought to you all that I took from my Jewish friends that I've known throughout my life is the question asking. That there's one thing that I think was like the trade-off in Christianity. Yeah, we have Jesus and a lot more, we have a lot of compassion talk. I think it would be unfair to say that Jesus doesn't also have a vengeful streak in the Gospels. There is a lot, like, you cannot ignore some of the burning pits conversation that happens. But because some of the scripture talks about like, I am the truth, we kind of thought we had like a stranglehold on what was true and accurate, and trying to bring in traditions that were more question-based, where you can ask one question and get 3 answers and that's all okay. I think that's where some of the Christian tradition is starting to take that a little bit more into consideration. Not saying that we have to have definite truth like we've tried to assert for a while. And so religion's always an exchange. We're always influenced by modern culture, by secular culture, but also by the other traditions we're around. Because yeah, in a similar way, Christians are rediscovering meditation and quieter practices, but like we've always had a monastic tradition.
Right.
It's just being reintegrated in a way.
Right. And I think, Chris, what you said is so it's so true. We do not exist in a vacuum, right? So if you go back to Genesis and you read you read the creation narrative, like, and then you read Gilgamesh, same story, right? So who had it first, and what was first? And the answer is, right? The shoulder shrug is the answer. But I think it is one of the things I value most about Judaism is the idea of asking questions, because I think the minute you say we have the definite answer, we know for sure this is the way to do it, and if you're doing it a different way, you're wrong. That to me goes right up against idolatry, because it's like, okay, so there's no room for other people who believe something else, and there's no room for, if you say this is the way to do it, and if you're doing it a different way, you're wrong, then there's no way for you to evolve either, right? There's no way for you to have a spiritual experience that explains something else that allows you to grow. right? So being open, I'm not saying like you should go around and be like, everything I believe is incorrect, but like being open to understanding that there could be more than one truth is a really important part of evolving as a human being and living in the world and being able to accept others for exactly where they are.
Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Rabbi Alicia, will you come back again?
I would be happy to.
Hearing all of this, and I feel like I could just soak it up over and over and over again. So I personally would like to say thank you, but please come back.
I would be happy to. It's my pleasure. You know, becoming friends with Pastor Chris has been one of the highlights of the year for me, for sure. And, you know, we've been friendly for a while, but we just hadn't quite gotten ourselves in the same room. And now we look at our professions and our callings in the same way. And it feels like a heart connection to me. So I'm always happy to be a part of your community. And I hope you all will become a part of ours too. It's important for us.
Yeah. Oh, well, Mary Ellen, your comment made me realize we are past time, which is always a good sign when conversation's so good that we passed our hour. So yes, personally, thank you for coming. It is an utter joy to have this exchange. Any other lingering thoughts? I don't want to forego anyone's last thoughts.
That's been wonderful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Well, with that, I normally pray us out, and you all hear me pray all the time, but I have asked Rabbi Alicia to do us the honor of pray us out for today. So would you pray?
Sure. Holy One of blessing, we offer so much gratitude for the ability to have complicated and tough conversations, the ability to hear one another. We ask that you continue to guide us and bless us in our search for closeness with you. We offer our sincere and deep love for humanity and for each other in our quest to find what works best for each of us. We are grateful for the opportunity to learn, to ask deep questions, to think, to stretch, to feel a little uncomfortable, and to grow. Thank you for bringing us together this morning. Continue to bless and guide this wonderful group of folks, and Pastor Chris and all of the people with whom we come in contact. We are so grateful. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.
My pleasure. What a joy. Thank you all so much.